About to get going. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Caffe Lena. Thank you for joining us tonight for our monthly featured storytelling series. So this series, it sort of split out of our original storytelling series, which combined the featured storytelling sets with an open mic. And now what we do is we have these featured storytelling sets on the fourth Tuesday of the month, and then the storytelling open mic is earlier in the month. Help me out with that one. First Tuesday of the month. Thank you, Janine. So tonight we have three people who have been featured storytellers before. They're all wonderful storytellers. They have their own unique styles, and it will be in alphabetical order tonight with Kent Busman, Lâle Davidson, and Kate Dudding. So they will introduce each other as we go along, but I will bring up Kent. So please join me in welcoming him back to the stage at Caffe Lena. Take it away, Kent.
Thank you. I've been looking forward to this for like a month and a half and had an upset stomach the same length of time. Just worried about it all the way. But hopefully my stomach will feel better when I'm done, and your stomach will be a little more exercised with some laughter, I hope. My first story owes more than a wink and a nod to the author Patrick McManus, who writes about outdoors people and reminds us that deep down we are all just terribly, terribly funny people. So I had a dream growing up, not like Martin Luther King Jr., but I still had a dream, and I got it early on when I was pretty young. And I hope my mom isn't watching, but I kept magazines under my bed in a box hidden under a blanket, and at night when it was really quiet and everybody was asleep, I'd pull that out and I'd duck under my sheets and get on my flashlight, and I would open these magazines up, and I saw things that a young boy couldn't have imagined in the world. I looked at those glossy photos, especially when you got to the middle and it was just all spread out like that. I was just enthralled. My heart would just get pumping, and you know the magazines. I'm watching it, right? Outdoor Life, Field and Stream, Bow Hunter's Digest. I don't know what you were thinking, but... And I read these magazines, and I looked at these pictures, and I saw things, and I knew that what I really wanted to be, my dream in life was to be an outdoorsman. And I got to practicing early on, because I had 3 older brothers. And the first time I went camping, I was with my brother Paul, who was a few years older than me, so he was smart. And so we got our gear already. We got our sleeping bags, the kinds we had in the 60s, those big cloth ones, and we rolled them up lengthwise, and we put them over our shoulders, and we tied them like this, like we were Civil War soldiers. And we got on our knapsacks, our green knapsacks, and we filled it through whatever we were thought we needed to survive. And then we got the pup tent. And the pup tents back in the 60s were these heavy, heavy canvas, single-walled canvassing, covered with some carcinogenic something to keep the rain out that probably has shortened my life exponentially. But we put that in the pack, and then we left home. Ma didn't know where we were going, but we walked across the road. We walked across Cleveland Street, down through the cow pasture, jumped the creek, came up, went through the barbed wire, walked a half mile through the cornfield, and we got to the woodlot. And we called it the coon pasture because we found a dead raccoon out there. And there's nothing little boys like better than dead animals. And so we were outdoorsmen. We found a copse of white pine trees, and there's a little clearing in there, and that's where we pitched the tent. And I got in there with the poles, held them up. My brother staked it out, and we'd read those magazines. We didn't just look at the pictures. We read the magazines, and we knew with our tents that we were supposed to dig a trench all the way around our tent, so we done it. And then we dug a hole for the campfire, and we were real outdoorsmen. We were so good at being outdoorsmen, we almost got the campfire lit that night. But then the rain came, and the rain put out our non-existent campfire. And it started to come down, and we crawled into that little pump tent together. And we're lying there in our canvas, or our cloth sleeping bags, and my brother says to me, he says, "Don't touch the roof of the tent." And I said, "Why not?" And he said, "Because it will leak." And I go, my brain's going, no. The magazines never said nothing about that. And I heard the rain coming on the top. And then it was like this invisible force that just sort of pulled my left arm out of my sleeping bag and brought it up like Michelangelo's Adam. And I went and I touched the roof of the tent. Nothing. Drip, drip, drip. It started dripping down. I heard the rain coming harder. So I did what any 8-year-old boy would do. I crawled in deeper into my sleeping bag and just sort of covered myself up with that cloth sleeping bag. So now it's dripping on the top and my breath is getting me all wet inside. And I knew the moment that the trench we had around the tent became a moat and overflowed. Because it was just like in the story of Noah, where the water from below and the water from above came down and crashed in on us. And we were in this pup tent, the lightning was going on, and we were floating around in there all night. And it's really hard to sleep that night. And the rain kept all night and was done by morning. And my dad came out, and he drove the old Ford Rambler around to Red Sheridan's sheep pasture, and he walked in the other way, the short way to get there. And I woke up to the sound of boots sloshing outside the tent, and we unzipped the door, looked out, all 2 drowned rats. My dad looked in and said, "You boys okay?" And it was my brother. And he said, and in outdoorsmen, you can tell by their eyes that they're real outdoorsmen. And I saw something had changed with my brother. And his eyes had lost the spark, and he said, "Well, so much for camping." And that was kind of the last time my brother and I ever went camping. But I hadn't given up. I was going to be an outdoorsman. So flash ahead 10 years, and I'm 18 years old, just graduated from high school. I'm in a 78 green Chevy Impala, driving across country with my friend Kevin and Fleetwood Mac and REO Speedwagon and the Steve Miller Band. And we're going across country, and we're going to go backpacking through the national parks. We got to Rocky Mountain National Park. We had a bad experience with the tent. Don't get me started on that one. And we got going, and we went down to Kings Canyon and Sequoia National Park. And then we got to Yosemite. And this is the day before there were weather people, and days before you could Google, what's the snowpack like, and what's all this stuff. And we were flatlanders up in Yosemite, climbing up past Half Dome on the backside, and post-holing deep in snow in July. That never happened in Michigan. But we got going, and we were above tree line, and it was starting to get dark. And there were no trees, and we didn't know where to pitch a tent, and we came across a little group of buildings, like a summer place that hadn't opened up yet, right? And there was one of them that was set up like a lean-to, like we have in the Adirondacks. Only instead of the roof just being a slanted roof like this, it was a pitched roof like a normal roof, and it had a top ridge beam. And I said, "Kevin, we can throw our bear bags, our food bags, over that ridge beam, and we can sleep on the floor here. We don't have to be in a tent," which is very exciting for me. And so we did that. We burrowed down in, and we got ready to go. We were nice and quiet, and then we heard some sniffing around outside the tent. We heard footfalls, poof, poof. And then it was a whomp on the roof of the lean-to. We heard this big scratching going, and our eyes were the only thing you could see. We just like lit up. We're just too scared to say anything. But then I did the one thing that you're supposed to do that I read about in the magazine. I pulled out my Boy Scout knife and I opened it up. And Kevin looked down and he says, "What's that for?" I said, "I don't know, but I'm supposed to do it." And he said, "Look at it again." And I looked down, and instead of pulling out the blade, I pulled out the spoon. But I was there, and we heard the bear on top of the roof, and we heard the bear bag start swinging with all our food in it, and suddenly they were gone, and we were boom, boom, and the bear jumped down, and we sat there for about 3 hours until it got light enough to move, and we looked around, and sure enough, there was the bear tracks, and sure enough, there weren't our food bags, so nothing to eat. And we hiked down in the early morning down to Tuolumne Meadows, and we got down there, and there's some tourists there that were cooking pancakes for their kids, and they saw, two sorry-looking kids and threw us some pancakes like we were raccoons. And I looked at Kevin, and something had happened, and his eyes had changed. And he said to me, he said, "Well, so much for camping." And that's kind of the last time that Kevin and I ever went camping together. But I didn't want to give up. And so I carried on, and I went to college and did the things I'm supposed to do, and I started to lead trips, and I ultimately got this weird job running a camp up in the Adirondacks, one of the most beautiful places in the whole planet. And I got to work there, and I got to teach kids how to camp, and I got to take them out canoeing and backpacking and things. And I was slowly, in my mind, becoming an outdoorsman. I still had an issue with tents and lean-tos. So I had a problem sleeping until my beloved wife, who's always smarter than me, got me the perfect gift. She got me for our anniversary once a hammock tent. A hammock tent. It's not on the ground. I like that. The rain's not going to come in from below. It had a rain fly. It's not going to come in from above. And this hammock tent was really interesting because you come into it from the bottom, the little slit that opens up with Velcro, and you break that Velcro open, and you come in and you turn around, you get into your sleeping bag, you sit down, you kick your feet up, and that Velcro closes, and you're safe and warm and snug like a little pea pod hanging up there. And it was a couple years ago, and I was out in early May, so it was cold, but I had a group of college students from Hope College in Michigan, and we had just canoed up Long Lake that morning. And we got to a campsite, and there was a lean-to there. I avoided it, but they all camped in there for some reason. And I pitched my hammock tent, and it was cold, so I still had an underlayer on, and I got into my sleeping bag, and I got in, and I put up. And it was one of those mummy bags, the kind that's really narrow at the feet and then just wide enough here. And I put the hood up, and I cinched it down so there's just my nose sticking out. And I'm lying there thinking, I did it. I lived the dream. I got to be an outdoorsman. I'm perfectly happy. I'm out. I did it. And as I'm thinking that thought, I thought about my foot. And the sock I had on had sort of slid half off. Now, you can put up with a lot of discomforts in the woods, but you can't sleep with the sock half off. So I lifted my leg up, but I could only get it so far before my knee and my foot locked into my sleeping bag there. And so then I took my left shoulder and down with my left arm, and I got to where I could just touch the sock, and then that locked into place. Now, when your body contorts that way, other parts of your body also move. And my butt had pushed down, and as I'm locked in and I can't move, suddenly I hear the sound of Velcro starting to peel apart. And the best way to describe this is if you ever watch Marlon Perkins' Mutual of Omaha back on Sunday night, of Wild Kingdom, and when the mother elephant gave birth, I'm there, and suddenly my hammock gave birth to me, and I popped out, wham, and bam on the ground. I'm still stuck in my sleeping bag, and I start to roll because I had pitched it on a bit of a hill overlooking Long Lake so I could have a nice view. And I start to roll down. I'm thinking, this isn't going to end well. But then, thanks to providence, luck, whatever, I hit 2 rocks and I was wedged in by 2 rocks. And I didn't go in the lake, but I couldn't get out either. So I was there until, fortunately, one of the students, she was an early morning riser. She looked at my hammock, she found I wasn't there, so she got the other ones up, and they started looking for me, and after a while, they found me. And they extricated me from the rocks, and they got me out. And I knew at this point that to have this dream of being an outdoorsman, you have to be able to say the right thing at the right time. And so when they got me out, I just looked at them from lying down on the ground, and I said, "You will never believe the dream I just had." This next story is also maybe about a dream. It's not as pretty of a one, but this story, the story is about my toolbox. I'm a carpenter of sorts. I can hold my own with a hammer. And I built a while ago, I built a toolbox out of some scrap pine I had. I made it 2 feet long so you could put a good framing square in there so it would fit right in there. Big enough to hold my tools. The handle is an old canoe paddle that I had. It was broken, a nice handle to hold onto, and it's got a leather strap that comes over. So when you really fill that toolbox up, you can put the strap up over your shoulders, and you can really help carry it to the job site. Now, normally my toolbox lives in our basement, which I call lovingly my shop. It's there, and it comes out on occasion to fix things around the house or to go around. But that all changed for my toolbox and hundreds of other toolboxes on August 28th, 2011, when Hurricane Irene came up from the coast and decided to make an inland journey and came up through the Schoharie Valley and flooded the Schoharie Creek. And towns like Prattsville and Middleburg and Schoharie were all flooded. This little creek that's usually not wider than this room flooded to over a mile wide in that valley and 6 feet deep in the town of Schoharie, and literally wiped the towns out along its way. And so what happened was a bunch of us grabbed our toolboxes and started running to Schoharie. Now, the first few times we got to Schoharie, there wasn't much use for toolboxes because it was all mud and muck. And what you really needed were 5-gallon buckets. And we would go into the houses, and you'd take your shovel and you'd scrape it and fill those buckets. And you can't fill up a 5-gallon bucket full very long before you can't carry it. But people were out dumping the mud out, and you'd go down into these basements, all right, where everybody has their canning jars and their pre-rusted tools are down there, and you're going through and you're starting to pull all their treasures out, and you're pulling them out to the street, and sometimes it'd be a person saying, "No, keep that. Oh, no, don't throw that out. Keep that." And it breaks your heart because their lives are caught up in so many of those things. So we mucked out the towns for quite a while. And then the day came when we could start using our tools. And you would go down and you'd get a job assignment. You didn't know what you're going to do. And you'd get job assignments. And that's when I started to lose my tools. My first job that I remember, I was working with my buddy Bruce. And we went to Moe's house. And Moe's house was down fairly near the creek. And his living room, the floor had all buckled. It had all been underwater. And what we had to do was we had to just the floor joists out, was we had to get down underneath the floor joist and put insulation up to heat it so it'd be nicer for Moe than it was when we started. Now, there are 2 ways to work when you go to Schoharie. One is to work as fast as you can, finish your job as fast as you can to get on to the next job. The second way to work when you're working in Schoharie is to work as though you're doing this for your best friend or the king or the queen, and you do the job as best you can. Nobody worked the first way. Everybody worked the second way. So my buddy Bruce said, all we have to do is take out one of these joists, and then you can crawl down under there and start putting the insulation up underneath it. Now, I'm the youngest of 4 boys. I understand pronouns. how we can turn into you very fast. So I did. Had my tool belt on, got underneath there, and hammered up this rigid insulation all day under there. There were two high school kids. I remember this. Two high school kids who came and joined us, and they were great. They didn't know how to do a thing and were totally worthless. But they were so happy to be there. And it still makes me happy thinking of them. We got done with the day, and so we put all the insulation up, and we made it so that we could get out, have the last piece of insulation up, and go. And when I got done, I realized I was missing my nail set. That's a little metal piece that you tap it in to set finish nails. And my nail set is under Moe's floor in Schoharie. The next time I went down, I lost something much, much bigger. It was a 4-foot drywall square, also given to me by my wife. Don't tell her that it's missing. I was down there with Neil and Jeff. Neil and Jeff, we were down there working. And I was doing some rough out stuff, and they were starting to hang drywall around the room, and I heard something that I never thought I would hear on a job site. I heard Neil go, "Hey, Jeff, do you have any lipstick?" And I hear Jeff say, "Why, yes, Neil, I do. It's cherry red. Is that okay?" And Neil goes, "That's my favorite." And I'm an open guy. But I'd never heard that on a job site before, so I kind of peeked around the corner looking at my friends, and they had taken the lipstick, and before they put the drywall up, they'd put it on the outlet boxes, covered it with lipstick, and then they pushed the drywall up against the outlet box so they would know right where to cut. I've got lipstick in my toolbox now. But I didn't have my 4-foot drywall square because I was so thrown off that I forgot it there that day. But it wasn't that I was the only one losing tools. Sometimes tools got lost to me. A few weeks later, we went down and we were assigned to house to work with Jack. Now, there were often like crew chiefs at the houses, and they were usually the oldest and orneriest people were the crew chiefs, and Jack was one of them, a lovely guy. Now, Jack was what I would call a serial cusser. It was cussing this and cussing that. And when he hit the electric wire that was still live with his snips, it was really cussing this and cussing that all morning long. And it was really fun for me to listen to Jack. And I was doing some work down on the floor, getting some measurements. And finally, Jack came over and says, "Well, what is it you do?" And I go, "Well, Jack, I'm a minister." And he goes, "No shit." Can I say that? Anyway, and for the rest of the day, he didn't swear, which made me really sad because I think people think that ministers don't want to hear you swear. It's just, we just want to be with you. We're just real people too. And so, but Jack had something that you put on the end of your drill, and when you drive a drywall screw in, it would stop your drill from putting it in too deep. It's called a dimpler. I had never seen such a magic tool, and I used that dimpler all day, and my drywall screws were perfect all day. And at the end of the day, Jack came over to me, went to shake my hand, said, "Great working with you." And when he put his hand away, I had a dimpler in my palm that he'd given me. Now, when you're working in Schoharie, at noon, the Presbyterian church bell rings. And when the Presbyterian church bell rings, you put down your tools and you meander out of all the houses that you're working in, covered in drywall, dust, muck, whatever, singed by electricity. You walk through and you walked over to the Reformed Church greeting house, and there would be food that appeared from I know not where and served by I know not who. But there were these meals, and you sat down with the guys from IBM who were down working for the day. You sat down with that crew who came over from Michigan, or the Mennonites who'd come up from South Carolina, or the 2 Mormons who were there, who were lousy painters, by the way. I mean, not all Mormons, but those 2 guys. We fixed it, don't worry. It looks good now. And you would sit and you would eat with these people because we were all down there for the same reason. We were all down there because Schoharie flooded. Now, there was one day we moved out to Prattsville, and we did a blitz build. And I had found a hammer at one of the times I was down there, and I was using that hammer in a bathroom at this little parsonage where this young pastor couple were, and they were getting all the drywall up. There were about 40 of us. And when there's 40 of you working, there's not just one toolbox. It's not everybody's own toolbox. It's like one big toolbox. And you're sort of using the tools that you need to get done. And I had that hammer, and I set it up in a wall and went to another room to work, and I got delayed for about 20 minutes. And when I came back, that wall was drywalled over. I know right where that hammer is. But I don't know where this hammer is. And this was my favorite tool that I lost. And before I came here, I was framing houses in Colorado, and I had a 32-ounce, 18-inch long, waffle-headed rig axe. And a rig axe is a hammer on one side, and it looks a bit like a hatchet on the other side. And you can get some serious damage done with that thing. And I was working at a house, and there were these 4 masked women from RPI. This is before masks were cool and popular. We were all wearing them. They wore those masks all day. I thought I was going to get robbed like 2 or 3 times. But they were working on things, and I was tearing out the cabinets. And with that 32-ounce waffle-headed rig axe, you can do a lot of damage and get a lot of therapy done, taking out those cabinets, pondering the big questions of life. And I got them down, and the church bell rang, and I set my tools down. And they were still carrying wood stuff out to the street where the real convicts were coming down and putting it all, we were working, and they were throwing it all away. And when I got back, my rig axe was gone. It somehow had gotten swept up with everything else and taken away, and my rig axe was gone. Like a lot of people who lost a lot of things, way, way more important than a rig axe. Now, I worry about Schoharie. I don't worry about the people. I don't worry about the town itself. They've rebuilt pretty well. They're pretty resilient people. They're Northerners. We can take stuff like this and keep going on. But I worry that the time will come when the Presbyterian church bell will ring and only Presbyterians will come. And I worry that we'll come to a time where we'll sit down at our little tables and we'll make up excuses about how we can't eat with Mormons or Lutherans or atheists or whomever or those people. But then I think when those thoughts arise, our toolboxes will start to speak to us. From under our floor, our tools will speak, or from out of our walls, our tools will speak. And if we have the ears to hear, maybe they can remind us of the lessons we learned from the lost tools of Schoharie. Thank you. Our next teller is Lâle Davidson, and you don't have to just hear her. You can also read her on your way home. You can get some of her books to read, right? So come on up.
Yeah, I was wondering about that. Thank you. Excellent. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out. And yeah, cold night, kind of depressing time of year, and depressing, like, what is it? We are on like the 4th wave of the pandemic. So, wow, you guys are the stalwart ones, the ones who keep on coming or going, or anyway. Thank you so much, Kent. That was wonderful. When he said he was going to tell stories about Schoharie, I have an ancestor who came to Schoharie in the 1740s. He was a Palatine German, and there's actually a little house, the Palatine house, in the middle of the cemetery that was his house, like a little corn crib. Anyway, but I'm not going to tell you a story about that. Tonight, I'm going to tell stories that are all kind of around the curse and the blessing, and specifically the mother's blessing. And my first story comes from Ireland. a bunch of my ancestors also came from Ireland. And I used to be part of the Snickering Witches, which was a collaborative storytelling group, and I did a lot of storytelling back in the 90s. And I came across a story then, and I think it was in a book of Jungian, analysis or something, and it was called The Corpse, and they said it was British. And so I used to tell this story about the corpse, and it features a mother's blessing or the lack thereof. And then when I got ready to tell it for tonight, I couldn't find that version. And I don't know I don't know really what the name of the author of the book was. So I found another version on emeraldisle.ie, the website, and it's called The Corpse Watchers. And I liked it so much better. And it's you can kind of tell from when you read a lot of folk tales, you can kind of tell which ones are older because of the kind of the pagan bits of religion that are in them. And you can almost see where somebody stitched on like a little Christian part, So it's kind of funny. You just, after a while, you get used to it. So I'm going to tell you start with a folk tale tonight. And Janine and I were talking about this. This is a folk tale that like you could spend a whole semester analyzing this folk tale. And we won't do that here tonight, though. I'll just tell it, and then you can think about it later. So the Corpse Watchers. Once upon a time, there was an old woman, and she had 3 strong daughters who were all getting to be young adults. And the oldest one said, "Mother, it is time for me to go out and seek my fortune." And she said, "That's good. Just wait, though, so that I can bake you a loaf of bread." And about an hour later, when the kitchen was full of the smell of toasted grains and yeast, she pulled that bread out of the oven and she broke it into 2 uneven pieces. And she said, "Daughter, would you like the small piece and my blessing or the large piece and my curse?" Well, the daughter, she was thinking she's got at least a 2-day walk to the next village, where there might be a job for her. And she's thinking, she said, that piece is little enough. I'll take that one. I think she also thought she'd had enough of her mother's blessings. So, whether she got her mother's curse, we don't know, but she certainly left that house without her mother's blessing. So I figure it was about, the distance from like here to Oneonta, which is about 88 miles. And if you're walking that over, hill and dale, it's, that's easily 2 12-hour days. So she walked and she walked and she walked and she walked until the night came wreathing around her. And she was exhausted. And she sat down by the side of the road and leaned up against an old wall. And she pulled her loaf of bread out. And a mother quail came out, and her 12 quail pups. And they all gathered around her, and the mother said, "Wilt thou share a bit of thy bread?" And she said, "Get away, there's hardly enough for me. Go fend for yourself, accountability, all that stuff." And the mother quail said, "Well, a curse on you, and the curse of my 12 quail pups, and your mother's curse, which is worst of all." And off she went. Well, the young woman, she didn't think much about that. She didn't really care, and she ate her bread, and it wasn't enough, and she was still hungry, and then she lay her head down to sleep, and the ground was hard, and it was cold, and she did not sleep well at all. Well, the next day, she walked all day long over hill and dale and through fields and forests until she came finally to the edge of the village. And she came to an enormous cottage. It was like a really grand cottage. Like, everybody lived in 1-room cottages, but this cottage had 3 rooms, and it had like lofts up there. And she thought, well, they must have money to, pay for somebody to work for them. So she knocked on the door, and a voice inside said, "Who's there?" And she said, "A young maid seeking a job." And the door opened, and there was an old woman, and she said, "We need that." And she explained that her son had died a few days ago, and they needed someone to keep watch over them. And I should tell you that they were having a wake, right? But now wakes have become sort of like a funeral home visitation. You just go and you say your respects and you leave. It's like a day. But in the olden days, wakes went on for 3 or 4 days because the whole purpose of a wake was to make sure that the person was actually dead, and like you were watching to see if they were going to wake. And actually, there's an expression on that website that says, "If the waked one wakes, the watcher better watch out." So she said, we need somebody to watch this, my son, and make sure that he stays dead, or let us know if he wakes up. And while you stay, you can have as many candles as you burn, as many nuts as you need to crack, as many needles as you lose, as much thread as you use, a bed of green silk above you and a bed of green silk beneath you, sleeping by day and watching by night. And if you succeed in watching every single night for as long as needed, we will give you a peck of gold and a peck of silver. And a peck is a basket, so it's a lot. And she was like, wow, sure, I'll take that job. So they invited her in, and they took her into the special room, which is like, there's a great room. There's a room that you enter that has a big fireplace, which is the center of the house. But in really elegant houses, behind that, there's another room, which is the good room, the parlor kind of thing. And that's where the corpse was laid out on a table with a sheet over his face. And when the family went to bed, she sat down before this very nice fire that they had provided for her, and their cat came in and their dog came in, and they sat down beside her. And she started cracking some nuts, and she lit a candle, and she started to sew. But, she was exhausted from all that walking, and she hadn't had enough to eat, and she soon fell asleep. Well, when the midnight bell tolled, the corpse sat up, and the sheet fell from its face, and he said, "All alone, fair maid?" Which is a pretty creepy thing to say, whether you're alive or dead. And she said, and he was like, "All alone, fair maid?" And she woke up, and she said, and then he said again, "All alone, fair maid?" And she's like, and she still could not speak. And so this was irritating, and he took out a hazel wand, and he tapped it on her head, and she turned into a stone on the wake room floor. Well, it wasn't very much later, maybe about a week later, that the second daughter, back in the old village, said, "Mother, it is time for me to go out and seek my fortune." And she also left home without her mother's blessing, and wouldn't you know it, she too ended up on the wake room floor as a stone. Well, another week passes, and the youngest daughter says, "Mother, it is time for me to go out and seek my sisters who went out to seek their fortune." And the mother said, "Okay, but just wait an hour and let me bake you a loaf of bread." And she said, "Okay." And so the mother baked the loaf of bread, and she pulled it out of the oven, and she broke it into 2 uneven parts. And she said, "Daughter, would you like the small piece in my blessing or the large piece in my curse?" And she said, "I'll take the blessing." And so she left the house with her mother's blessing. And she walked all day long with that little piece of bread wrapped up in a cloth. And she walked and walked and walked until the night came wreathing around her, and she sat down on the side of the road, and unbeknownst to her, at the very same wall where her sister had sat before her. And she pulled out her bread, and she was thinking, well, it's really not enough. And all of a sudden, the mother quail came out, and her 12 quail pups, and she said, "Wilt thou share a bit of thy bread?" And she was like, "Yeah, there's hardly enough for me, so might as well have at it." And she broke it up into crumbs. And, they all started to eat very mindfully, and they started to really appreciate, like each crumb, like some were stringy, kind of stretchy, that's that good gluten. And some crumbs were crisp, and they just really paid attention. And a funny thing happened. By the time they had finished eating, it was enough. And then the birds, quails do this wonderful thing. They're very, very communal. And when they sleep, they like to sleep they put their butts in the center, and they face out around like that, so they can kind of keep watch and sleep. So that's what they did. They sort of all gathered around her with their butts up against her and facing outwards, and they puffed up their feathers the way birds do when it's cold. And it was like she was sleeping in a feather bed, and she slept so well. Well, in the morning, she walked all day, and she came to that very same house, again, unbeknownst to her, and it looked like a very grand house, and she knocked on the door, and the voice said, "Who's there?" And she said, "A young maid seeking a job." And the door opened, and there was the woman. And she explained the job, that her son had died, and she needed somebody to watch the corpse at night when the family was sleeping. And while she stayed, she could have as many candles as she burned, as many nuts as she cracked, as much thread as she used, as many needles as she lost, and a bed of green silk above her and a bed of green silk beneath her, sleeping by day and watching by night. And if she should succeed in watching the corpse every night for as long as was necessary, she would get a peck of gold and a peck of silver. So the young woman said, "That I will take that job." And she was invited in and brought into the parlor where the corpse was laid out on the table. And after the family went to bed, she peeked and she was like, "Oh, it's so sad that he's kind of handsome, and it's such a shame that he died so young." And she covered him back up, and she sat down before the fire, and she lit a candle, and the cat came in and the dog came in. They sat beside her. And she started to sew, and she was pretty well rested because she'd had that good night's sleep the night before. So she was staying awake, and, time was going by, and the midnight bell tolled. And the corpse sat up, and the sheet fell from his face, and he said, "All alone, fair maid?" And she said, "No, I am not all alone. I've got this cat, and I've got this dog, and these candles, and these nuts, and these needles, and I'm not alone at all." And he laughed, and he was like, "Wow, you're courageous, and but you're gonna need a lot more than that to follow me where I'm going." And she said, "Oh?" He said, "Well, I have to go to the quaking bog, and I have to go to the burning forest, and then I have to go through the cave of unending terrors, and then I've got to climb a glass mountain and jump into the sea of the dead." And she said, "Well, I was engaged to follow you, and I will follow you, I will. I'm supposed to keep watch on you all night, so I'm coming." And he tried to dissuade her, but she was as stiff as he was stout, and he gave up finally, and he jumped out the window, and she clambered out after him into the moon-silvered night. And as soon as he was outside, he stood before the hill, and he said, "Oh, great hill dark, open wide, and let the light of the green hills through." And the hill cracked down the middle, and with a groan it opened up, and a gasp of musty air came out. And she said, "And let the young maid through too." And then the two of them entered into the hill, into the other world. They soon got to the quaking bog. And the corpse, he just stepping on a little bit of shaking moss and a little bit of sinking sod, he managed to make his way across. But she, when she put her foot on what she thought was a hummock of grass, sunk down to her knees in mud. And she was just trying to figure out what she was going to do next when this beautiful fairy queen appeared. And she was clothed in a quail feather dress, like all spotted and gray and tawny, kind of amber bits here and there. And she said, "Hello, I am the fairy queen of quails. I was that quail that you fed the other night. And because you shared your blessing with me, I will share my blessing with you." And she tapped her feet with a hazel wand. I should mention the hazel tree is obviously a magic tree and very important in the Irish mythology. So she tapped that foot with a hazel wand, and her shoes kind of grew a foot out in front and a foot out in back, so she had sort of like snowshoes on, but they were bog shoes. And so she was able to get across the sucking marsh fairly easily. Well, no sooner had she gotten to the other side, but the burning forest arose before her with its limbs crackling and curling in the heat of that forever burning brimstone fire. And she was just, and the corpse just kind of like whirled through like a little whirlwind with no problem at all. And she was thinking, she could feel the heat on her face. She was like, no way was she going to do that. When the fairy queen of quails appeared, and she placed on her shoulders a heavy woolen cloak with a hood on it, and the cloak had been soaked in the saltwater fountain of Manannan, who is the god of the other world and of the sea. And so she was able to get through that burning forest without so much as a hair singed on her head. Well, then she came to the cave of unending terrors, and the corpse was nowhere in sight. All she saw was a few footprints into the cave, and there were these ghosts and demons wailing and screaming and wreathed in blue light, and slimy frogs and ghouls and snapping their rotting jaws. And It would have driven her mad, as it would drive any living human being mad, but the fairy queen of quails appeared, and she tapped her ears, and her ears filled up with the beeswax of Lear's own beehives. And so she was able to get through that terrifying place. It was still scary, but not nearly as much because she couldn't hear all the sounds. Well, she got to the other side, and there's this enormous glass mountain, and the corpse just kind of right up to the top, like he has suction cups on his feet. And she puts one foot on it, and of course she slides down. This is a whole new kind of barrier. Like everything else had been about hardship and pressing through and heat, but this was slippery. So what was she going to do? The fairy queen of quails appeared again, and she tapped her feet and made them so they were sticky on the bottom of the shoes, and she was able to run up the glass hill to the top. Well, there she was at the top of the hill with the great ocean of the dead about a quarter mile below them. And it looked cold and fierce, and it had waves that were as big as houses that kept crashing on the glass cliffs. And the corpse turned around and he said, "You should go home. You have done your job better than anybody ever could. And just go home and tell my mother that you did your job and that she should pay you and you should go." And she said, "Oh, no, no, no. Oh, no, no. I always finish what I start. The job is not done." And his eyes rolled up to his sockets, and he just fell over backwards all the way down into that icy ocean of the dead. And she jumped without thinking right after him. Well, it was a long way down, and the cold air just kind of sucked the breath and the voice right out of her throat. And she started to panic as she was getting closer and closer to the waters, and the fairy queen of quails was not appearing, when all of a sudden she collected herself, and she made herself into the shape of an arrow, and she parted the waters. And she swam down deep into the ocean, and there she saw way down at the bottom these glimmering green lights. So she swam with all her might towards the green lights, and she burst through the lights and found herself in a beautiful meadow with flowers, red flowers and yellow flowers and purple flowers all around her. And there was the young man, no longer a corpse, but a bright-eyed, rosy-cheeked, living, virile young man. And the sky was as green as silk. And she's like, "Whoa, I am tired." And he said, "Well, you might be." And she sat down beside him, and he held out his arm, and she fell asleep on his shoulder into this very deep sleep and woke up in the cottage where she had originally started, and the mother and the son were now keeping watch over her. And as soon as she opened her eyes, they said, "Good morning, have a cup of tea." And the mother said, "You have saved my son." This witch had come, and she wanted to marry him, and he refused. And so she put a curse on him that had him stuck between the world of the living and the dead, which is why we needed to keep an eye on him for such a long time. And the son said, "Yes, and we needed a woman such as you, someone who was courageous and kind and ethical, to save me." And she said, "Well, you're very welcome." And so, but something was kind of poking her under the blanket, and she felt under there, and there was this hazel wand. And for some reason, she felt compelled to touch it to these two stones on the floor, and her sisters came back, all flesh and blood, and they fell upon each other, laughing and crying. And, the young woman was kind of looking at the guy, and it was kind of cute, and he was kind of looking back at her that same way. And she said, to her sisters, "Why don't you take the peck of gold and peck of silver and take it back to Mom, and you guys enjoy, because I think I have all I need here." And the love between them was more than any peck of gold or peck of silver. And the two of them, with his mother, lived happily ever after. Yeah, it's an interesting story because there's 5 tasks instead of 3, and I love the little bit about Manan and the god. And I just think it's so interesting that here's this pagan ritual of some kind, clearly some kind of it's clearly some kind of recipe for how you sort of become a shaman that's kind of tacked onto the story about this Catholic wake, so as if you really kind of need your pagan background to survive, in the modern world, such as it is. So the other stories that I wanted to tell you, when I was about 30, probably because I told that story, I came to this place of like, I need my mother's blessing to kind of grow up. I'm 30, I finished graduate school, I've got a job, I had married. My first marriage was really disastrous. They say that everybody has 2 marriages, and some to the same person. My second husband's here, it's worked out very well. But the first marriage was kind of disastrous, but I was kind of just feeling like I hadn't gotten my mother's blessing. And what is a mother's blessing after all? And here's what I think it is. I think it's when the mother looks at her child and says, I see you, I hear you, I understand that you are different than I am, and you are still okay, and you're going to be okay in the world. You are going to go out into the world, and I may not agree with everything you do, but you're going to be okay. That's the mother's blessing. And I felt like I couldn't quite get that from my mom. And of course, whenever I went to her to try to get it, I was probably going about it all the wrong ways. And so we would end up fighting, and it just got worse and worse. So I decided that what I would do is I would write a story. I would collect all the stories of all the women who had ever blessed me in that kind of mothering way, both in large ways and small. And I would like collect them like beads on a necklace, and I would, string them and wear them. And so I don't. It was a long story. It was 30 pages, so I don't have time to tell you all those stories tonight. I'm just going to tell you 2. One of them was my Spanish teacher from high school, Pilar, was from San Sebastián, Spain, and she had this fantastic accent, which I would never insult her by trying to imitate. But she always these wonderful round vowels and these very, thick consonants. And I just loved the way she taught Spanish. Like she would hold up a word. She's like, oh, the Spanish word for waterfall. And she'd hold it up like she was hiding a jewel. And she'd say, it's catarata, catarata. And the light of that beautiful word would just kind of pour over you like sunshine. So I loved how she taught Spanish, but really her chief gift, she had this gift for looking around at all the young students, and when she could see the trouble in their faces, and when she saw trouble in somebody's face, she would say, come and have a cup of tea with me. And she would just kind of get you to talk about what was going on. You might not have even known that you were upset, but as you talked, all these truths would come out, and then she would tell you stories. So that was definitely the mother's blessing, like she could see me and hear me. And here's one of the stories she told me. When she was growing up in San Sebastián, she was Catholic. Everybody in Spain probably was Catholic at that point. And, this movie had come to town from America. It was a scandalous movie. She can't remember what it was, but she thinks it might have been From Here to Eternity, where Burt Lancaster, and I can't remember who the female lead is, but there you go. They're rolling around in the waves, very scandalous. And they were like, no good Catholic girl should ever go to that movie. So, of course, Pilar went right away. And then the Monday morning, they go to school and they have confessional, I think, every day. So they're doing their Monday morning confessional, and all the children, all the young women are there in their little white uniforms with little pleated skirts, and they're sitting in the pew waiting, outside the confessional as each person takes a turn. So she goes in and she tells the priest, I went and watched From Here to Eternity, and he's like, what? You pig! And he says it so loud that everybody outside the confessional can hear. And he's like, and you will do penance. You must walk up this such and such a hill with chickpeas in your shoes so that they cause you pain, and you will learn from your pain about your sin. Well, she came out of that confessional just a flaming red and also angry. Like, why? Like, this was the first, like there were several moments in her life where she was like, something's not right here. Like, why is this priest humiliating me in this terrible way over something as ridiculous as this movie? So she did her penance with the chickpeas in the shoes, but she cooked them first. So that was a good lesson to me. So the last story I'm going to tell you also is from that piece, and this is like a small blessing, because some of the blessings just came from these momentary interactions with strangers. And it's called The Pigeon Lady, and it is. I did bring my books. I had published a couple of books in the fall by Red Penguin. So one's called Strange Appetites, and it's cheap. It's only $7. And Pigeon Lady's in that one. And then I also have a longer novel about a mother who spontaneously combusts. Yeah, no suppressed rage there. So anyway, The Pigeon Lady. And this is also takes place, when I was married to this first disastrous marriage. What do I want most in the world? I'm walking in Central Park, and the fan-shaped ginkgo leaves are fluttering down yellow around us. And I'm walking with my new husband and his socialite friends, and it's fall, and the sky is low and gray, and the water's just beginning to let down in these fine pinpricks. And my hands are cold, and I shove them into my coat pocket, and they tangle in the torn lining of the pocket. It's a coat that my husband and I have argued about. It's like this. I really love this coat. It's like short wool I'd gotten at a secondhand clothing store for like only $8. It was pure wool, but it was kind of pilling a little bit, and the cuffs were kind of worn out, and there's holes in the pockets. And my husband wanted me to get rid of it because he was a young entrepreneur. He was trying to move up in the world. He was trying to he'd started a business, and he wanted to be renowned for his good business and for his wealth. And he felt that having his wife walk around in this worn coat sort of reflected badly on him. I could not relate. So I walked ahead of them, and this ruffling explosion startled me, and I pivoted to the right, and I saw this enormous flock of pigeons take off into the air straight for my head, beating the air with feather and bone, and the sound was like 1,000 sheets unfurled and snapping in storm wind. And I ducked, and I swiveled around the other way, and the pigeons all were flying over this pond, and they were settling all down and around this old woman that I hadn't seen standing there before. There was something strange about this woman. First of all, she had this enormous plastic bag full of crumbs that she was feeding the pigeons, and that had caused the riot. But she had very, very black hair. It was like much too black for her age. And the other strange thing is that she wasn't looking up at the pigeons or down at the pigeons. I couldn't really make out her eyes. All I could make out was this very, very dark coal eyeliner all around her eyes. And she seemed to be looking straight across the pond at me. And with the pigeons all kind of settling around her, sort of graphing the air from high to low, from front to back, it seemed as if she was floating in the air, like, that painting of Magritte's Floating Businessmen? It's kind of like that. What I want is for this woman whose very presence has caused a riot of flapping wings. I want this woman whose orange-red lipstick is shining out across the grays of late fall. I want this woman who's patting a pigeon in the crook of her neck with her arthritic hands under her frazzled plastic black wing. This old woman who's, blessed or homeless, I'm not sure, who maybe has had to search the garbage to get such a big bag of breadcrumbs, or has struck up a relationship with the cooks of certain restaurants. I want this old woman to look at me and say, "I bless you." May you also be blessed, and may you find your blessings or make your blessings out of the curses so that you may be a blessing to others. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming. Wow, it's a lot of storytelling, isn't it? We need to take a deep breath and breathe in and get ready for the next amazing storyteller, Kate Dudding.
We are now in the non-curse section of the program. I'll be telling 3 personal stories. I assumed that when our son was born, that he would love to read. Both his parents loved to read. All 4 of his grandparents loved to read also. So I started reading the classics to him. Pat the Bunny and Where's Spot? And then we graduated to real picture books. Goodnight Moon and Where the Wild Things Are. And we stayed there for a while, and you know, I remember the very first chapter book I read to him. Now, I had gotten it out of the library for me, not for him. He was 4 years old, and my husband, we will have our 50th wedding anniversary this Saturday. Woo! I've decided he's a keeper. I digress. He was going to be away for work purposes for a whole week. And when that happened, I went into survival/fun mode. I did just what we needed to survive. I didn't try to balance the checkbook. I didn't, clean. I just, got us where we needed to go, had us fed, had some fun. And then he would go to bed, and I would have gotten some special fun things for me to do after that was done. And one of the things I always did before my husband's infrequent business trips was to go to the library and get out books and VHS tapes. This was in the late 1980s. And while I was in the library that time, I thought, gee, I remember my favorite chapter book from when I was a kid. I never bought a copy, but Half Magic by Edward Eager. I wonder if the library has it. And they did. So I got it out for me. And I brought it home, and my husband went off on his trip. And one night, when it was time to read to my son, he spotted my book, Half Magic. He said, "Mommy, read this to me." I said, "Oh, it's not a picture book. It's a chapter book." He said, "It has pictures in it." Well, there was one picture on the cover. It was this size book. And each chapter had a little picture on it. And then somewhere in the chapter, there was a full page picture. He said, "It has pictures." I said, "Okay, we'll try." It worked wonderfully. He loved it. I loved revisiting it. I loved introducing him to it. There was only one problem. Each chapter ended at a high point, and I was looking for, and now it's time to go to bed. But so I had to be very careful to go beyond the end of the chapter to where it, okay, now it's time to go to bed. So that was the first chapter book he read. And then we went on to others. Paddington, very good. Each chapter is self-contained. I highly recommend it. And then let's see. Oh, the Indian in the Cupboard series and the Prydain series by Lloyd Alexander, starting with the Book of 3. Yes, things were going fine. Time passed. He went to school, first grade. He was learning to read. Oh, he brought home some very boring books. A Cat Sat, a whole book with almost all short words with the short sound of A in it. Anyways, second grade, he started getting books with 2 syllables. Ooh, that was pretty exciting. But then we got a call from his teacher that she thought he needed to be tested. He had some problems reading and writing. And would we agree? And we said, well, if he needs it, yes. But when we went to speak to the school psychologist who had been testing our son to hear the results, I was uncomfortable, didn't know what was going to happen. But then Ann Long said, "Your son is such a neat kid. I've really enjoyed testing him. I'm going to miss not seeing him every day." I thought, oh, She not only gets my kid, she loves him. Oh, I can trust whatever she's going to tell me. Us. So she said, I have good news and bad news. The good news is your son has the vocabulary of a fifth grader. But the bad news is he has the reading ability of a first grader. Now, I know he's only in the second grade, but that gap is going to probably become very important, that the only books that he can read, he won't be interested in. And he could be turned off from reading for his whole life. And I went, no, my son, no. That really upset me. She said, but we can do several things. I recommend that he gets extra help in school. I recommend that you take him to a tutor once a week who specializes in these areas, and that you read aloud to him the books that fit his vocabulary, but that he can't read. We already do that. And okay, and we agreed those were all good things to do. I remember the first time he met his tutor, Lynn Greenwald. She said, "Hi, Mark, my name is Mrs. Greenwald. What do you like to read about?" "Dinosaurs." "Great, I have lots of books about dinosaurs, but I'll get more." And things were improving. That he had to learn different strategies to read two-syllable words, and et cetera, et cetera. But then we were in a bookstore. It might even have been Borders on Broadway in Saratoga. And Mark comes running up and says, "Here's a book of Calvin and Hobbes." And it was a big book. And can we get it? And his father said, of course, he's as always, "Yeah, sure." And I turned to my husband and said, "It costs $13. And he said, "It has words and he wants to read them." Oh, right. I got it. No, I love Calvin and Hobbes. We would read the comics together, and Calvin and Hobbes was one of the highlights. But anyways, we got Calvin and Hobbes and even some Archie comics, but it had words in them. Our son, now 36, said the Calvin and Hobbes books have weathered much better than the Archie comics. That I don't think he has any of the Archie comics anymore. So time passed. It seemed almost overnight from when I was saying, "Please, Mark, read to me for a while and then I'll read to you," until it flipped to, "Mark, please stop reading while you are walking." That was around fifth grade. At least, I'm sure by fifth grade he was reading at grade level. As I said, now he's 36, and he always has some books either that he can listen to or that he can read on his iPad. So because of his early experiences with those classics, Pat the Bunny and Where's Spot, and the help he got from the school psychologist Ann Long, his tutor Lynn Greenwald, and his other teachers, and Calvin and Hobbes, my son loves to read. Thank you. I remember the very first time I played music on my mother's piano. I was 8 years old, and I had just had my first piano lesson. My teacher had pointed out the patterns of the keys on the keyboard, that there were 2 black keys together and then a gap, and 3 black keys together. I'm doing this from your perspective. Okay. And that pattern goes up and down the keyboard. But to find middle C, really important in playing the piano, it's the white key near the middle of the piano, but the white key next to the pair of black keys. And then she taught me how to play a song. She had me position I can't do this backwards, position my right hand, thumb on middle C, D, E, F, and G. And then I started playing D, 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 D. So when I got home, I did that too. My mother was in another room when I had my piano lesson with Sister Joseph, so I was going to show her all that I had learned. So I sat down at her piano and I found middle C, and then I saw the title of the brand of the piano, which was painted in gold and black above, Acusonic, and that C in Acusonic was right above middle C. I just loved that. It just seemed so right. Now, I don't remember when my mother got that piano 3 years earlier, but I remember my mother telling me that story. She said, now, when your brother was 8 and in 3rd grade, and you were 5, ready to start kindergarten, your father came home for lunch one day, and it was August, and I had hay fever really badly, and I was sneezing, and your father said, Seal, go buy something. And so I did. I went to a store that I knew was having its annual sale in August. Now, your father was probably thinking I was going to buy a hat. This was 1955. Women wore hats. I don't think they wore them when they went to the grocery store, but anything elevated above that, certainly church, you wore a hat. But I went to the Baldwin Piano Store for their Tanglewood sale, which they would actually sell the pianos that had been used at Tanglewood by the students, and that was their end of the year sale. And my parents bought the Acusonic Spinet. It was the color of an Irish setter, red mahogany with sort of, I won't say orange, tawny overtones. It was just beautiful. Time went by, and I was very proud of Jingle Bells, but one note at a time is a little lonely, a little thin, the song. Luckily, that first piano book, they had they also put duet music in for the teacher to play, but my mother could play them. And so she was playing chords while I was diddling around with one note at a time, and that really filled the house more with music. And as I progressed in my lessons, I had 5 years of lessons, my mother would buy duet books that we'd play together. In the next level of when I could play with both hands at the same time, I had gotten that far. It was classic songs, and one of our favorites was the Evening Prayer from Hansel and Gretel by the original Engelbert Humperdinck. Da 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 da. That was my solo. I would always scrutinize. Like my son would scrutinize the pictures, I would scrutinize the duets looking for the simpler part, and I would play that. And it was often on the low notes. So we would play together. We never started out, 1, 2, 3. We never counted it out. We just I would follow her lead, and after we played it several times, we would know the tempo. But I think sometimes we were nodding our heads together at the beginning to start off. And then the ultimate duet we attempted to play was an arrangement by Ferranti and Teicher. They were pianists. We have Ed Sullivan Show, grand pianos. The theme from Exodus. Bum, bum, ba-da-da-da-da. Still my part. Bum, bum, my mom. Ba-da-da-da-da. Bum, 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 bum. Oh, we filled the house. The neighbors could hear us if the windows were open. Yes. Time passed. My brother and I grew up. He took lessons. I took lessons for 5 years. And then we each bought our own piano. My husband had promised me when we got married, as soon as we have a house, we'll get a piano for you. And so we bought one at Baldwin's August Tanglewood sale. They had the same sale on the Baldwin store on State Street in Schenectady that they had in Fairfield, Connecticut. And I got my taller walnut school upright with the bass strings, very long, bigger sound. Anyways, my brother in Michigan bought a piano he could play with his feet, a player piano. You have to pump it. Now, if you try to play William Tell Overture on a player piano, it is an aerobic experience because, especially when you're approaching the finale, there are lots of notes, lots of holes in the piano roll, which means it needs a lot of air, which means you have to pick up your speed. And anyways, time passed as it always does, and my parents had died, and it was time to break up the family home. Some of you have probably gone through this experience, and the closest relatives take what they want. My brother and I didn't have any arguments about who wanted what. We were interested in different things. And then my mother's sisters, who lived near her in Connecticut, they took what they want. And then there was the triage of what can be sold, what can be given away, what you have to pay people to take away. And my aunt said that they would take care of that. And they called in secondhand dealers. And you see, no one wanted my mother's piano. My brother and I had our own, and my aunts were at the age, about what I am now, that they were no longer acquiring things, they were getting rid of things. So my aunt had to get, my youngest aunt got an estimate as to what its worth was. And she was the one who was there when the movers came that were taking away the bulk of the furniture. And one of the movers said, that piano in the corner, that's not on my list. And my aunt said, your boss didn't want it. And he said, oh, is it for sale? She said, oh, yes, I got an estimate, but I haven't figured out how I'm going to sell it. He said, oh, my daughter has just started taking piano lessons, but all we have is an electronic keyboard. How much do you want for it? And my aunt told him, he said, oh, great, I want it. I get off work at 4. This is the night the bank is open late. I can get the money, and I can round up a truck and a friend. We'll be back here at 5. Can you meet me here? And my aunt said, okay, but in case something happens, let's exchange phone numbers. And so they did. My aunt was back at 5, and he showed up as promised, truck, friend, and money. And my aunt watched my mother's piano go out the front door of the house it had only known. It had been there for over 30 years. And she thought that was it. But she got a phone call later that night from the mover, and he said, I wanted to call and thank you. My daughter loves her new piano. And my aunt could hear this other little girl playing music for the first time on my mother's piano. And when she finished that piece, she laughed for joy. We decided that my aunt had found a good home for my mother's piano. Thank you. And if you'd like to see a photograph of an acusonic piano with a C over middle C, I did find one by Googling acusonic 1995 and found, I was not imagining this. This is a true story. Okay. And since I talked a little bit about my mom, it seems only fair I talk about my dad too. My father died in 1983 when he was 68 and I was 32. I have a lot of regrets about his death. A main one is that our son was born 2 years after my father died, so they never met. But another regret I have is that I never really established an adult relationship with him. Oh, I always knew that he loved me. That was never in question. There's this wonderful picture of me, my first Easter. I'm 6 months old. I'm wearing this tiny little dress with little rosebuds, pink rosebuds on it. And he's holding me like a sack of groceries. And I'm looking out, and he's looking down at me, just beaming love. It flows off of the photograph. I always knew he loved me, but we had different interests. He was big on sports, watching it on TV and actually bowling and fishing and golfing. I was into knitting and playing the piano like my mother did. So 17 years after he died, I was thinking about this. Obviously, I could not establish an adult relationship with him at this point, but I thought maybe if I could clearly define ways in which I resembled my father, I would feel more connected to him. So I started going through the pictures just to remind me of things. And I realized for the very first time, I have my father's smile. The shape of my lips and the shape of my teeth, they are his. No one ever mentioned that to me. So that was really cool. And then I remembered Pachysandra. Do any of you know what Pachysandra is? It's a ground cover that grows in the shade. Someone had taught my father how to propagate Pachysandra. So he had propagated and planted Pachysandra under all the shade trees in our yard. It was no surprise when my husband and I bought our first house that my father showed up with my mother on their first visit with a flat of Pachysandra. And he said, "Where do you want me to put it?" Now, while I have never, actually, this fall I started trying to propagate Pachysandra. And about 2/3 of the plants that I started are still alive. I'm growing them inside the house because I didn't do it in time outside, so I did it inside. Anyways, we have hopes that I am going to do it. But when we had our second house built, I planted a lot of perennials around the house as well as some of the shrubbery. So our interest in gardening, that made 2 ways I resembled my father. And then, I remembered whenever he joined an organization like Purchasing Agents Association or Trout Unlimited, he always got involved. And I'm that way when I join a lot of organizations, like the storytelling ones and the Women's Fund of the Capital Region. 3 ways. Okay, good. And I'd forgotten this. How I could forget this, I don't know. Our love of playing cards. I grew up learning to play rummy, and then gin rummy, and cribbage, and 4-handed pinochle. We always played the boys against the girl, my father and brother against my mother and me. And sometimes my parents played with the neighbors against boys against the girls, or my grandparents. Love of cards. And our son loves cards too. We play 3-handed pinochle together. So since that love of cards has gone down to the next generation, I call 5 ways I resembled my father. But then I couldn't get any farther. I tried and I tried, but I just couldn't get any farther. And it wasn't enough. So I put that idea aside. But Christmas Eve that year, something happened. First, there was a minor pseudo-miracle that I'd finished serving Christmas Eve dinner and we'd cleaned up and I still had some energy and there was nothing to do. The presents were wrapped, the food was ready for the next day that had to be, and I still had some energy. So when somebody maybe it was my brother's wife, somebody suggested we play ping pong. We had a ping pong table downstairs for the first time, and it ended up boys against the girls, my husband and son playing against my sister-in-law and me. And I found myself saying something really strange. Partner, good shot. I'm sorry, partner. I'll do better next time. Partner, partner, partner. I had no idea where this was coming from. I had never played doubles, anything that I could recall. I'm not really athletically inclined, and you don't use partner. Well, you could in dancing. I digress. Anyways, this partner talk, I had no idea where it was coming from. But when I was getting ready for bed that evening, I realized that was my father's pinochle talk. When he was playing pinochle with my brother or Mr. Barker, the neighbor, or my grandfather, he goes, good hand, partner, or, we'll I thought we could make that bid, but we didn't. That's okay, partner, we'll make it up. That's where I got that. And that was 6. That was the 6th way I resembled my father. And I realized that there are probably others that I would discover as time went by. But I knew then, as I know now, still, deep in my heart, I am my father's daughter. Thank you. Thank you. And that's it. And I think Reese comes out and says something, or maybe not. But thank you all very much for coming. And Janine, you have something?
Just to remind people that the 4th Tuesday of February, there will be another one of these wonderful events. But say that in the mic so that
Okay. Janine asked me to remind you that the 4th Tuesday in February, there will be another program like this with 3 featured tellers, as there will be in March, the 4th Tuesday of the month. Thank you very much.